The morning was crisp, the kind of autumn air that carried the scent of damp earth and burning wood from distant chimneys. Mark Evans pulled his coat tighter around himself as he walked along the riverbank, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. Beside him, his German shepherd, Rex, trotted with his usual alertness, ears pricked forward, muscles taut beneath his thick fur. Even in retirement, Mark had never lost the habit of scanning his surroundings, a detective's instinct that clung to him like a shadow. Rex, however, was behaving differently today. He wasn't just sniffing idly at the ground or chasing the occasional drifting leaf. He was tense, focused. His dark eyes flicked toward the river more often than usual, and when Mark tried to call him to heel, the dog barely acknowledged him. "What's got into you?" Mark muttered, rubbing the back of his neck as he followed Rex's gaze. The river stretched before them, sluggish yet deceptively deep, its surface broken by swirls of current. It had rained the night before, and the water level was higher than usual, creeping dangerously close to the walking path. Then, without warning, Rex bolted. One moment, he was at Mark's side. The next, he was sprinting at full speed toward the water, kicking up damp leaves in his wake. "Rex!" Mark's voice cracked through the air, sharp with panic. The German shepherd didn't hesitate. His powerful legs launched him off the edge of the bank, his body soaring for a brief second before vanishing beneath the churning water. Mark was already running before he could think, his heart pounding against his ribs. The river was fast, too fast. Whitecaps churned as the current pulled Rex downstream, his black and tan form barely visible against the murky water. Mark skidded to a stop at the edge, fingers clenched into fists. He had seen Rex swim before. He was strong, trained, and fearless, but this was different. There was no reason for him to have jumped, unless he saw something. "Come on, boy," Mark whispered under his breath. A small crowd had begun to gather along the embankment, early joggers, an old man walking his terrier, a woman pushing a stroller. Murmurs rose among them, eyes wide as they watched the struggling dog. Then, just as quickly as he had disappeared, Rex resurfaced. Mark exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him. But that relief turned to ice as he realized his dog wasn't swimming back. Rex was pulling something. The water fought against him, but Rex held firm, his powerful jaws clamped around an object nearly the size of his head. As he paddled closer, the object came into focus, pale, misshapen, and wrong. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mark took a shaky step forward. His breath caught. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't an animal. It was a severed human hand. The fingers dangled limply, waterlogged and colorless. The wrist was jagged where it had been torn or cut away. But it was the ring that made Mark's stomach drop. A silver band, simple but distinctive, gleamed in the weak morning light. He had seen that ring before. Time slowed. The sound of the river faded beneath the roaring in Mark's ears. His mind, trained from years of analyzing crime scenes, was already moving, piecing together possibilities. A body. There had to be a body. Shouts erupted from behind him. Someone had already pulled out their phone, dialing the police. Rex, exhausted, stumbled out of the water, dragging the grisly discovery onto the muddy shore. He dropped it at Mark's feet and shook himself violently, spraying water across the onlookers. His chest heaved with exertion, but his eyes never left Mark's face. For a moment everything was silent. Then a child's voice, small and uncertain, broke through the stillness. "Is someone missing?" Mark swallowed hard. The answer was obvious. Someone wasn't just missing. Someone was dead. Asterisk. He crouched beside Rex, his hand finding the damp fur behind the dog's ears. Rex whined softly but stood his ground. His work wasn't done. Mark looked at the severed hand, then back at the river, his mind racing. Who was out there? And how much worse was this about to get? The flashing red and blue lights cut through the morning fog, bouncing off the damp pavement as officers swarmed the riverbank. The scent of wet earth and something metallic, something Mark recognized all too well, hung heavy in the air. Detective Sarah Whitaker stepped out of her unmarked vehicle, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had seen too much and carried it all in the tight set of her shoulders. Her auburn hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and the lines on her face, though subtle, hinted at sleepless nights and long hours at her desk. She barely glanced at Mark before crouching beside the severed hand, now sealed inside an evidence bag. "You found this?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with something unreadable. "Rex did," Mark corrected. Her eyes flicked to the German shepherd, who stood rigid beside Mark, his ears still pricked forward, nostrils flaring. "Hell of a find," she muttered, standing. "We've got a dive team on the way. If this came from somewhere upstream, we need to locate the source before the current scatters evidence any further." Mark didn't respond. His focus remained on the evidence bag, on the way the pale fingers curled slightly, frozen in time. "And that ring. That damn ring." Sarah noticed. "You recognize it?" Mark hesitated. Then, "It belonged to Lisa Carter." The name landed like a hammer. Sarah inhaled sharply, her composure slipping for half a second. "That can't be. Lisa Carter went missing 3 days ago." "Which means she didn't go far," Mark said. A grim silence settled between them. A uniformed officer jogged over, his radio crackling. "Divers are in the water now, ma'am. We should have an update soon." Sarah nodded. Then, turning to Mark, she asked, "You still keep up with the old cases?" Mark exhaled through his nose. "Hard to forget the ones you never closed." Lisa Carter had vanished without a trace. No signs of forced entry, no known enemies, no immediate reason to disappear. And now, 3 days later, part of her had washed up in a river like discarded evidence. Something was wrong. Mark felt it deep in his gut, the way he had all those years ago when a case twisted in a way that didn't make sense. He should have walked away. He was retired. This wasn't his job anymore. But Rex was pacing. Restless. The dog knew something Mark didn't. He followed Rex's gaze back to the water, to the slow-moving current that carried secrets beneath its surface. And then, as if on cue, a diver emerged, waving frantically to the officers on shore. They had found something. A body. The moment the stretcher was pulled onto land, Sarah took a sharp breath. The woman was face down, her clothing soaked and tangled with river debris. But even before they turned her over, Mark knew. Lisa Carter. Her skin was pallid, her body waterlogged, her face barely recognizable. But Mark had seen enough bodies in his lifetime to know the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. Something about the way she had been left here didn't sit right. Bodies in the water usually tumbled, battered by rocks, tangled in roots, stripped of identification. But Lisa? She had been placed. Almost preserved. And then there was the detail no one could ignore. Her other hand was missing. Sarah exhaled slowly. Jesus Christ. Mark crouched beside the body, careful not to touch anything. His mind was already working, flipping through memories of old cases like pages in a book. This wasn't the first time a severed hand had appeared near this river. 2 years ago, a man's hand had been found near the South Bend. No body, no suspects. 5 years before that, another. Both cases had been quietly shelved, no connections made. Until now. Mark clenched his jaw. We're not dealing with a random death. This is a pattern. Sarah stared at him. Are you saying we have a serial? Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The evidence spoke for itself. Rex let out a low whine. He was staring at the tree line beyond the river, ears twitching. Mark followed his gaze. Deep in the woods, past the crime scene tape and the scattering of officers, something moved. A shadow. A figure. Watching. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Mark barely had time to process what he had seen before Rex took off. The dog launched himself forward, powerful muscles rippling beneath his damp fur as he bolted toward the trees. Rex hold. Mark barked, but the shepherd didn't slow. Sarah spun, catching sight of the movement just as Mark did. What the hell? There was no time to explain. Mark was already moving, his instincts kicking in as he sprinted after his dog. He could hear Sarah cursing behind him, the officers shouting, but the sounds dulled under the rhythmic pound of his boots against the wet earth. The figure had disappeared into the dense woods beyond the riverbank, but Rex's relentless pursuit meant they weren't far. The shepherd weaved between the trees with deadly focus, his body low, ears flat. He was hunting. Mark's breath was ragged by the time he crested a small ridge, the underbrush thickening around him. The air smelled of damp leaves and decay, the morning mist lingering between the trees like ghostly fingers. Then, suddenly, silence, Mark skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. Rex stood motionless in a small clearing, his body rigid, hackles raised. His lips curled slightly, a low, warning growl rumbling from deep within his chest. Something was here. Mark reached for the gun holstered at his hip. "Show yourself." His voice was steady, but his pulse pounded against his ribs. For a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. The only sound was the distant murmur of the river, the soft rustle of wind through brittle leaves. Then, a whisper of movement behind him. Mark barely turned in time. A figure lunged from the shadows, a flash of something metallic catching the weak morning light. Instinct saved him. He threw himself sideways, feeling the rush of air as a knife sliced past his ribs. Rex exploded into motion. The shepherd leaped, his powerful jaws clamping down on the attacker's wrist. A strangled scream rang out as the knife clattered to the ground. Mark rolled, drawing his gun as he came up on one knee. "Don't move." The attacker was on the ground, writhing beneath Rex's grip. Mark's breath caught. He knew this man. Daniel Crow. A ghost from the past, a name that had once been spoken in hushed tones in briefing rooms and across worn-down desks. A man suspected, but never convicted, of murder. Mark's fingers tightened on the grip of his gun. "What the hell are you doing here, Crow?" Daniel gritted his teeth, his face pale, sweat slicking his forehead. "Call your damn dog off." Mark ignored him. "You ran. That means you're hiding something." Crow gave a breathless chuckle. "Or maybe I just don't like cops." Rex snarled, his teeth sinking just a little deeper, and Crow flinched. Sarah came crashing through the underbrush, gun drawn, 2 uniformed officers on her heels. She stopped short, eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Mark, what the hell?" Mark cut her off with a sharp look. "It's Crow." Sarah's expression darkened. "You have got to be kidding me." One of the officers moved forward, yanking Crow onto his knees and slapping cuffs onto his wrists. He didn't struggle. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "You think I killed her," Crow murmured. "Don't you?" Mark clenched his jaw. "I don't think. I know." Crow tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Then you're a fool." Sarah stepped forward, her voice taut. "Why?" Crow held her gaze for a long moment before he spoke. "Because Lisa Carter isn't the last." The words landed like a gunshot. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of something unspoken. Mark's stomach turned. He had seen killers break before, seen them snap, fight, lie, plead. But this wasn't that. This was confidence. Crow wasn't afraid. He was waiting. A crackle came through Sarah's radio, breaking the stillness. "Detective Whitaker, we've got something." Another shallow grave. About half a mile upriver. Mark felt the world tilt beneath him. Another grave. Another body. And something told him this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The forest was eerily silent as Mark and Sarah trudged through the damp undergrowth, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of decaying leaves. The crime scene ahead was bathed in the harsh white glow of portable floodlights, their beams slicing through the early morning mist. Officers moved in controlled efficiency, marking evidence and speaking in hushed voices. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil, but underneath it, Mark swore he could detect something else. The faint, metallic tang of death. Rex was tense at his side, his muscles coiled like a spring, his nose twitching. The dog knew. Sarah stopped beside him, her breath coming in short, measured exhales. If Crow's right, if Lisa wasn't the last. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. A uniformed officer waved them forward. It's bad. Mark had seen bad before. He had spent years untangling the worst kinds of crimes, dissecting the brutality that people were capable of. But as he stepped closer and his eyes adjusted to the gruesome sight in front of him, he felt something rare and unsettling crawl beneath his skin. The body was posed. A young woman, partially buried in a shallow grave, her pale skin muddied but eerily preserved, as though the earth had not been eager to claim her. Her arms were folded neatly over her chest, and like Lisa Carter, her hands were missing, Mark's stomach churned. Same pattern. Sarah's voice was tight. Which means the killer isn't finished. A forensic tech approached, his face pale. You're gonna want to see this. He handed Sarah a small evidence bag. Inside was a scrap of fabric, dirty, torn at the edges, but unmistakably deliberate. Mark's throat went dry. He had seen that before. Sarah turned the bag over in her hand. This is from Lisa Carter's apartment. Mark's mind raced. That wasn't just evidence. That was a message. The pieces were falling into place, but something wasn't right. Crow had been watching them, waiting to be found. He had wanted them to chase him. He had led them here. And then it hit him. Sarah, he said, his voice low and urgent. We're looking at this wrong. She frowned. What? Mark swallowed hard. Crow isn't the killer. She blinked. Of course he is. You saw him run, you saw the way he... Mark shook his head. No. He's involved, but he's not the one doing this. He's too calm. Too calculated. He gestured to the body. This is personal. Ritualistic. Crow's a predator, but this... He exhaled sharply. This is something worse. Sarah's face paled as realization dawned. They had arrested the wrong man. A crackle of static from her radio shattered the moment. Detective Whitaker, we have a problem. Sarah pressed the receiver. What kind of problem? There was a hesitation. Then, Crow's gone. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Sarah stiffened. What do you mean, gone? He escaped. Mark swore under his breath. This was the plan all along. Crow had never been afraid of being caught. He had counted on it. A sharp bark snapped Mark's attention downward. Rex was growling, his eyes locked on something beyond the tree line. Mark followed his gaze, and his blood turned to ice. Between the trees, barely visible in the shifting shadows, a figure, watching, waiting, Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone.